Chapter 3. What the second little mouse had to tell.
I was born in the palace library,
said the second mouse.
I and other members of my family have never known the luxury of visiting a dining room, much less a pantry. Only on my journey and here today have I seen a kitchen. In the library we often went hungry indeed, but we got a great deal of knowledge. The news of the royal reward offered for making soup from a sausage peg finally reached us. It was my grandmother who promptly ferreted out a manuscript, which of course she couldn't read, but from which she has heard the following passage read. If one is a poet, one can make soup from a sausage peg. She asked me if I were a poet. I told her I was entirely innocent in such matters, but she insisted that I must go forth and manage to be one. I asked how to do it, for that was as hard for me to learn as it was to find out how to make the soup. But my grandmother had heard a good many books read, and she told me that 3 things were essential: understanding, imagination, and feeling. If you can manage to get these into you, you'll be a poet, and this business of the sausage peg will come to you by nature. So off I went, marching westward, out into the wide world to become a poet. I knew that understanding comes first in everything, because the other 2 virtues aren't half as well thought of. So I set off in search of understanding at once. Yes, but where does it live? Go to the ant and be wise, said the great king of the Jews. I learned that in the library, so I did not rest until I came to a big ant-hill. There I positioned myself to watch and learn wisdom. The ants are a very respectable race. They understand things thoroughly. With them, everything is like a well-worked problem in arithmetic that comes out right. You work and you lay eggs, they say, for you must both live your life and provide for the future. So that is just what they do. They are divided into clean ants and those that do the dirty work. Each one is numbered according to his rank, and the ant queen is number 1. What she thinks is the only right way to think, for she contains all wisdom. And it was most important for me to learn this from her. But she talked so cleverly that it seemed like nonsense to me. She asserted that her ant-hill was the highest thing in all the world, though quite close to it grew a tree which was obviously higher. It was so very much higher that there was no denying it, and consequently it was never mentioned. One evening an ant got lost in the tree. She climbed up the trunk, not to the very top, but higher than any ant had climbed before. Then she came home and told of finding something even more lofty than the ant-hill. The other ants considered that she had insulted the whole community. She was muzzled and condemned to solitary confinement for her life. Shortly afterward, another ant climbed the tree, making the same journey and the same discovery, but this ant reported it with suitable caution and diffidency, as they say. Besides, she was one of the upper-class ants, one of the clean ones, so they believed her, and when she died they gave her an eggshell monument to show their love of science.
The little mouse went on to say,
I saw the ants continuing running to and fro with eggs on their backs. One of them dropped hers and tried to pick it up again, but she couldn't manage it. 2 others came to help her with all their power, but when they came near dropping their own eggs in the attempt, they at once stopped helping, for each must first think of himself. The queen ant said they had displayed both heart and understanding. These 2 virtues, she said, raise ants above all other creatures of reason. Understanding must and shall always come first, and I have more of it than anyone else. With this, She reared up on her hind legs so that all could see who she was. I was sure who she was, and I ate her. Go to the ant and be wise. And I had swallowed the queen. I now went over to the tree I mentioned. It was an oak, with a mighty trunk and fur-flung branches, for it was very old. I knew that a living spirit must live in it, a dryad, as she is called, who is born when the tree is born and dies when it dies. I had heard of this in the library, and now I saw such a tree with such an oak maiden. She shrieked frightfully when she saw me so near her, for like other women she is terribly afraid of mice. But she had more reason to fear me than others have, because I might have gnawed through the bark of the tree on which her life depended. I spoke to her in a cordial, friendly fashion, and told her she had nothing to fear. She took me up in her slender hand, and when I told her why I had come out into the wide world, she promised that perhaps that very evening I should find one of the two virtues for which I searched. She told me that fantasy was her very good friend, that he was as beautiful as the god of love, and that he often rested under her leafy boughs of the tree, which would then rustle even more softly over these two. He called her his dryad, she said, and the tree his tree, for the magnificent garland oak just suited him. He liked his roots, which went down so deep and steadfast in the earth, and the trunk which rose so high in the clear air that it felt the pelting snow, the driving wind, and the warm sun as they ought to be felt. Yes, the dryad talked on. The birds up aloft there sing and tell of distant lands. On the single dead branch the stork has built a nest which is very picturesque, and he tells me about the land where the pyramids are. Fantasy loves to hear all this, but it's not enough for him. I too must tell him of my life in the forest, from the time when I was so small and the tree so tiny that a nettle could shade it, until now when the tree is so tall and strong. Sit down under the sweet thyme and watch closely. When fantasy comes, I shall manage to pinch his wings and pull out a little feather. Take it. A poet can get no better gift, and it will be all you need. When fantasy came, the feather was plucked, and I took it,
said the little mouse.
I soaked it in water until it was soft. Still, it was hard to swallow, but I nibbled it down at last. It's no easy matter to become a poet, with all the things one must cram into oneself. Now I had both understanding and imagination, and they taught me that the third virtue was one to be found in the library. For a great man once said and wrote that there are romances whose only purpose is to relieve people of their superfluous tears, and that these romances are like sponges, sopping up the emotions. I remembered that a few of these old books had always looked especially tasty. They had been thumbed quite greasy. They must have absorbed an enormous lot of tears. I returned to the library and devoured a whole novel. That is to say, the soft and essential part, but the crust, that is the binding, I left. When I had digested this, and another one too, I felt fluttery inside. I ate still a third, and there I was, a poet. That is what I told myself, and that is what I told everyone else. I had headache, stomachache. I can't remember all the different aches. Now I began to recall all the stories that could be made to apply to a sausage peg. Many pegs came to mind. The Ant Queen must have had magnificent understanding. I remembered the story about a man who could take a white peg out of his mouth to make both himself and the peg invisible. I thought of old deer with a peg stuck in it, of peg legs, and round pegs in square holes, and the peg to one's coffin. All my thoughts ran on pegs. When one is a poet, as I am, for I have worked like mad to become one can turn all of these subjects into poems. So every day I shall be able to entertain your Majesty with another peg, another story. Yes, that's my soup.
Let's hear what the third one has to say, the king commanded.
Squeak, squeak,
they heard at the kitchen door, and the fourth little mouse, the one they had given up for dead, whizzed in like an arrow and upset the cape-covered sausage peg. She had been running night and day, and when she saw her chance, she had travelled by rail and the freight train. Even so, she was almost too late. She pushed forward, looking the worst for wear. She had lost her sausage peg, but not her tongue, for she immediately took over the conversation as if everybody had been waiting to hear her, and her alone, and as if nothing else mattered in the world. She spoke at once, and she spoke in full, and she appeared so suddenly that no one had time to check her or her speech until she was through. So let's hear her.